Hi, Jamie.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
I can't complain. How are you doing?
You know, I try to complain once in a while and no one listens, so I just stop.
You've had that experience too.
Yeah.
It's not just me.
Yep.
Well, let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Jamie Metzl, author of the book Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity, which I think is a very important book, raising important questions. You're also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and you served on the National Security Council under President Clinton. And you were deputy staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a senator named Joe Biden.
Yep.
So does that mean that even as we speak, you're jockeying for a position in the new administration?
I'm not. Most everybody I know is, and it's great because our country is in deep trouble, and we need all the great people we can get. But I've been very, very busy with my work on human genetic engineering. I'm part of the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and our big report's coming out. And I've founded, with other people, a global social movement called OneShared.World. So I'm kind of all in with the things that I'm doing, but I certainly am enormously supportive of the Biden administration, and there's a lot of work for them to do and for us all to do in supporting this change that we need. Okay,
so let me summarize my understanding of your argument, and then you can tell me if I've got it wrong. I mean, basic idea is, like it or not, the age of designer babies is upon us. As people know, people are already using in vitro fertilization, along with selectively reimplanting the eggs to screen for specific genetic diseases and even cognitive deficiencies. People are screening to avoid having babies with Down syndrome if they choose in some cases, and so on. But we're starting to go beyond that, and certainly will be soon, and have the capacity to actively, enhance, look for what you could call genetic enhancements, although the line between, preventing a pathology and an enhancement isn't always as clear-cut as you might think. But in any event, it will increasingly be possible for parents to at least increase the likelihood of their babies having extraordinary capabilities in the cognitive realm, in the physical realm, in the emotional realm, and select for certain personality traits and so on. And this raises a lot of ethical questions. It raises policy questions at the domestic level. I think the more challenging, as challenging as those are, the most challenging policy questions are probably at the international level, and you spend time on that. And it's interesting that your background is in national security, because I think way too little attention is being paid to that whole issue. So, so far, do I have that about right?
I think it's a pretty good summary of the book. The only question that I would raise is really designer babies. There's so much baggage associated with that word. Mm-hmm. So when lots of people think of designer babies, they think it's kind of like going to the mall to the Build-A-Bear workshop, and you say, "I'll have these buttons for the eyes and this color fur and these overalls and whatever it is." And really, it's along a continuum, a spectrum. And so we've already begun this journey changing the way that we make babies through in vitro fertilization, through what's called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or testing or selection, whatever the words are, that people are already using. And it's not that we're just going to jump into this kind of futurist world where people are building babies from scratch, but there's going to be a continuum, and that we're going to move forward on that continuum, not because every day we're going to make a decision, do I want a designer baby or not, but because we're going to want better healthcare. We're going to use genome sequencing to unlock all kinds of secrets about what it means to be a human because they'll be very relevant and very useful in our lives. And over time, that's going to change the way we do all sorts of things, including healthcare, procreation, manufacturing. But also, people have a delusion that we just that what we are now is some kind of expression of a state of nature. I mean, nature didn't immunize us. Nature didn't build cities. Nature didn't do all these things that have fundamentally transformed the way that we live. So we have to recognize how, quote unquote, unnatural our lives already are. Otherwise, we'll see even incremental additions of applying technology, incremental steps forward in applying technologies as more radical than they are in the context of our progression as a species.
Yeah, I mean, human nature was designed by natural selection's design criteria, and it's not obvious that these are the morally optimal criteria. The animal that's best at getting genes into the next generation is the kind of animal there will be. So, in a way, it's good to have the option to depart from that design criterion, I guess.
I'd agree with that. I think that's really an important thing. First, that there's no good or bad in evolution. There's just being particularly well suited for a given environment. And second is the nature of Darwinian evolution. The essence of random mutation is that there'll be a bunch of changes in every next generation of every species. Most of them won't really matter much. Some of them will hurt you and some of them will help you. And we already, through our healthcare system and other ways historically, have means of addressing those copying errors when they show up as terrible, deadly genetic disorders that we think are worthy of treating. And so we have never been a species that has said, oh, well, I guess nature has an error rate and we'll just call that fate. When somebody's child is born with some terrible disease, we fight the disease to save the child. We don't say, oh, there's Darwin at it again. And that's what we're going to continue to do, just with more powerful tools. Okay.
So why don't I want to get to all of this. I want to first, touch on, kind of what exactly the state of our knowledge is, how we can expect the advance of science and technology to increase our power in this realm to do the things that we want to do if we decide they're good things. Before we start on that, I just want to ask, you begin the book in a way I wouldn't have necessarily predicted, describing your own experience at a place where you can have your sperm frozen, and that being part. You're doing that in compliance with the advice you give other people. Apparently, when you speak on this subject, as you say to, I guess, young adults especially, you recommend that they have their eggs and sperm frozen now.
Right.
And I guess that's partly because as time goes on, they are, they may themselves be eggs and sperm are more likely to have problems.
Right.
But why, elaborate on why you think they'll regret it if they don't.
The summary is because the cost of doing it is very small, but the cost of not doing it is potentially big. I certainly believe that our species is going to move toward increasingly, never completely, but increasingly having children using IVF and embryo screening and ultimately genome editing of pre-implanted embryos. And if that's where we're heading for some logical reasons connected to thinking that we can do better than the error rate of nature on its own, people are going to want to have their sperm or eggs stored, extracted, and frozen and stored when they're younger, just because that's safer. I mean, that the sperm and eggs of a 30-year-old, 35-year-old, 40-year-old have taken on a number of mutations, and risk levels go up with time. And as long as we're going to do it that way, or even think we may do it that way, why not store now? And it's certainly easier for men than for women. For men, as I write about in the book, it's kind of like you go into essentially the broom closet. They give you a little plastic receptacle and some dirty magazines, and depending on your whatever, you're kind of done. For
what's
women,
not to like, right?
Exactly. For women, it's a surgical procedure. It's not a major surgical procedure, but every surgical procedure comes with risk, and you have to take hormones, and that's not something that's comfortable. But still, I just think that the potential benefits outweigh, in my mind, the relatively small downsides, one of which is cost. And that's why I certainly am supportive of assisted reproduction services and technologies being included in national health plans and under insurance plans. And that's something that happens in places like Israel, and it doesn't happen here. So there are real issues. It's not that I think this is all simple and straightforward. But I do think this is where our species is heading. I do think that, you come back 50, 100 years from now, or just live long enough to see it, and we're going to be making babies very differently from the way we're doing so now.
Okay. So we should probably say at the outset, you're not saying that genes are everything.
Right.
I mean, after all, you can look at two genetically identical twins who've been reared apart, and they're different in all kinds of ways. At the same time, studying
they're more similar than people would assume, and people would assume that two identical twins separated at birth are not more similar to each other than two fraternal twins raised in the same household. But on average, that's been the case in lots of different areas.
Right. So studying identical twins reared apart, on the one hand, establishes that there are, that genes are important. It's one of the most important methodologies we have for studying that. At the same time, you can show that they're different in important ways. So genes aren't everything, but clearly they're important. And I guess in terms of, clearly we have to have a lot of knowledge to do what you're talking about, knowledge about the genes. At the same time, you don't always have to understand exactly how they work, right? I mean, in principle, if you have enough data, if you just do big data and you have enough information through gene sequencing about the genomes of different people and the traits they exhibit, you can say in a probabilistic way, I assume, that okay, if your kid has this gene instead of that gene, then they have, an 80% chance of being, good at math or a good sprinter or something, right? So there's a certain amount of the knowledge you need to do this stuff that you can get without really understanding exactly how things work, right?
Yeah. No. So the two essential points there. The first is how can we make decisions based on systems that we don't fully understand? On one hand, that's scary for people because in our lots of places in our world, we have algorithms that are making decisions about all sorts of things. And it can be very difficult, and it's getting more and more difficult to understand how the algorithm is ultimately coming to a certain conclusion. But if we were to decide to say, well, the only algorithms that we'll use are algorithms that we can 100% perfectly understand and unpack, we would be basically curtailing a big chunk of the future of artificial intelligence and machine learning, simply because there are complex patterns in the world that are beyond just the raw computing power of our brains. And so I think we need to, it's hard for people, but this isn't just a biology or genetics point. This is a broader point. We're going to have to get, and we will get more and more comfortable with building smart machine learning algorithms and using them to understand things that we would have a hard time explaining without those machines. And that leads to the second point about predictions. And the reason why we need these massive data sets of millions and hundreds of millions and billions of people's genetic or genotypic and life or phenotypic information is so that we can begin discerning these complex patterns. And it's really challenging because the same genetic pattern or similar genetic pattern in two different people may lead to a different outcome unless you look at the entirety of their system's biology, which is a pretty big task. We're already in the early stages of being able to make relatively accurate genetic predictions, not across the board, but in some pretty key areas. First, starting, which is much easier for Mendelian disorders, single gene mutation disorders, and that's more like an on-off switch. But then now we're entering the new era of essentially called polygenic risk scoring, but it's essentially polygenic scoring because it doesn't have to be risk related. And that's looking at patterns of genes. So let's say, and this is possible now, you have 10 embryos in the same group of embryos from the same parents, and you can roughly rank order them in potential range of height relative to each other. And there are other traits where that's possible. And increasingly, we're going to be moving in that direction where just exactly as you said, we won't have perfect information about your ability to be a great abstract mathematician or sprinter or how tall you are or your IQ. But there will be relational and directional information, and we will use that to make decisions.
Mm-hmm. So, assuming then that this knowledge base continues to grow, the question becomes, how does the technology advance? Does the technology give us more and more leverage as time goes on, to make use of this knowledge? And I gather there are a couple of things. One is that the number of eggs you have to choose from is now, in principle, much greater than it used to be. And then the second realm would be, of course, when we get in and actually edit the genes. That's a whole new kind of leverage.
Yeah. So there's 2 points. So the first on the number of eggs, we aren't yet there for humans. The number of eggs you have is the number of eggs you have. But in animal models, stem cells are already being used. So basically what you do is you take an adult, a differentiated cell, you revert that cell to a stem state called an induced pluripotent stem cell. And then you basically, let's say, skin cell to stem cell to egg precursor cell to egg cell. You kind of go back in time and then forward in time. And then in animal models, we're able to create basically an unlimited number of eggs. And given that the number of human eggs is limited, that's actually something that's really important, and it's very, very useful. We aren't yet there in human models, but I think that we're going to be. And what happens when we do is it increases our ability to choose, because if embryo selection for the near term is going to be our driver of decision making and will be more impactful than genome editing at this early stage, the larger the set of embryos from which choices are being made, the more choice there'll be. We now have three people, to the second question, people in the world that we know of who were born after having their early stage embryos genome edited by this highly unethical biophysicist in China. And we aren't ready for the next stage of genome edited, pre-implanted early stage human embryos, but we will be, and that's where our species is heading. It's not going to be a straight path. Dieter Egli and others have done great research showing that when they did CRISPR edits on early stage embryos, there was what they called chromosomal mayhem. And so
sounds like a bad thing.
Chromosomal mayhem is a bad thing, but certainly the trajectory of these kinds of interventions. I mean, it was 6 years between when Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier released their seminal paper on CRISPR as a means of editing a cell, not a human cell, but just a cell, or the genome, forgive me, the genome of a cell. 6 years later, the world's first CRISPR babies were born. So we are moving on really an exponential rate of growth. So I've really no doubt about where we're heading. And then that's why I know we're going to talk about ethics later, but that's why ethics needs to be part of the conversation now, because this science is moving quickly, and it has to be, the ethics have to be woven into the process at every level. Okay,
so what's kind of the most amazing thing that, in principle, parents could do now? I mean, suppose there were no ethical constraints or legal constraints, just given what we know now, and without resorting to highly risky things, which I gather the CRISPR still is.
Right.
What kinds of selections can parents in principle be making now that might surprise us?
Yeah. So you asked two questions. I'll answer them. What's the most amazing thing that parents can do? I mean, which seems pretty incredible to me, is to make a new human life through sex. I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling. But in terms of, let's say you wanted to apply as much science as you could safely apply, well, first, here are the things that you could do. You could do the genetic analysis of each parent and their before you even get pregnant. So that would give you some information. Then you can extract the mother's eggs through in vitro, and then extract them and fertilize them with the father's sperm through IVF. Then you could grow each of those pre-implanted embryos, let's say it's 10 of them, and extract a few cells from each and do a genetic analysis to choose which of those embryos should be implanted in the mother. Or if you really want, this wouldn't be safe now, but this is the way it would happen in the future. You would take the egg, take the sperm, and take a vector for genome editing. And at the same time that the sperm was fertilizing the egg, you add in that genome editor to make, probably at this stage, one change. And most people would not want to do that. Actually, nobody would want to do that now. But I can imagine in a relatively short number of years, some people where both parents are carriers of some kind of genetic Mendelian disorder, who want to have their own biologically, genetically related child, might want to do that. So we're really right at the cusp. I mean, IVF and embryo screening are huge revolutions, but we're all about to enter an era, and whether it's 5 years away or 10 years away doesn't really change the historical trajectory. We're about to enter this era where we're going to begin with relatively simple edits, either of pre-implanted embryos or of egg or sperm precursor cells. And the reason why that's appealing is that you can have much more iteration. Like if you're screening 100 million sperm cells that you've edited, I mean, it may take a long time unless it's automated, but there's a lot of power that comes with that. And so the basic point is there'll be possible interventions at every stage of the life cycle, at the sperm and egg, precursor cell, sperm and egg, embryo, fetus, and then person.
Okay, and in terms of traits, in terms of things I could, traits I could seek to, have in my offspring, what are the most surprising ones that science currently permits? In other words, we have found that certain genes are correlated with a certain thing. You could test for that gene in an embryo and make the decision accordingly. I mean, it sounds like height we could already do.
Yeah, so let me say, what are the things that you could do now that you want to do? what are the things that you could do now that you may not want to do, and what are the things that you might be able to do in the future? So the things that you could do now that you want to, that people are already starting to do, is to screen out deadly or dangerous single gene mutation disorders. We were already doing it. Certainly, there are all kinds of ways that now chromosomal abnormalities like Down syndrome are being screened for, mostly now through non-invasive prenatal testing. And then most people in most parts of the world with that analysis or with that prognosis are choosing to abort, more in Northern Europe than the United States, but about 2/3 here in the United States. We're moving toward a greater ability to do that kind of screening at an earlier stage. But I think, so those are all things that are happening now. There are companies like Genomic Prediction that are starting to provide information to potential parents and their doctors, doing polygenic analysis of complex genetic traits. And it's really, really tricky, because when you move from a world of greater certainty to a world of greater probability, but you have to make big choices like which embryo to implant, the consequences are pretty high. Genomic Prediction was attacked because they were providing some information about people who may have some kind of intellectual impairments, and they had to pull back initially from providing that. And so we're moving into a very sensitive.
In other words, these are not official pathologies, so to speak, or.
Well, I guess that's the really tough question. And you mentioned earlier about the line between therapies and enhancement. I mean, we have these things that we call pathologies because we have some vague sense that there's a boundary along the spectrum of every trait that we have, but a lot of that is set in context. I mean, certainly there are traits that are selected against now that actually would provide benefits in some other circumstances. There are things that we think of as absolute, but they're just relative to our culture and moment in time and history. And so I think that's what's so challenging about all this.
So what got this company into trouble? Were they saying, look, here, there's an 80% chance that if you implant this egg, then what? Then they won't be good at math? Or what? I mean, what were they saying that got them into trouble?
The accusation essentially was you're screening people based on intelligence, even though that wasn't essentially what they were doing or what they thought that they were doing. That was the accusation against them. And when every conversation that we have about this, about genetics and capacity, tends to run into trouble. I mean, there are certainly very poorly formulated expressions of this, like from the bell curve years ago. And even today, David Wright at Harvard and others who are talking about these issues, it's really, really sensitive. And I think that's, if someone says that a company is screening for intelligence, then all hell breaks loose, and that doesn't mean there shouldn't be any criticism, because people say, well, what is intelligence? Is it culture specific? Is it discriminatory? All of these kinds of issues, and that cuts against what I think that we're discovering, and it's not crazy in my view to say it, is that there are genetic differences between all humans, and when groups of humans are isolated from each other for thousands or tens of thousands of years, they end up having differences, which is why people look different, why Tibetans are better suited for living at altitude than most of the rest of us. But when we start screening for those things, when there's the idea that we can identify who is more or less of something, then I think the specter of eugenics tends to seep in, and that motivates, activates, or scares various people.
Yeah, well, I mean, most of the, concerns about eugenics aren't necessarily connected to race, in other words, a certain amount of this is almost inherently controversial.
Yes.
And it's not like issues of race naturally arise if a doctor looks at 3 eggs created by my wife and says, well, this one, is more likely to do this. But it's certainly true that that's part of the historical backdrop that makes any discussion of genes controversial. I take that point. And I also take the point that the knowledge. We were talking about probabilistic knowledge. It sounds like in this case, I guess they were saying, they felt they could say that this gene gives you a greater chance of having a certain intellectual trait or maybe a few more IQ points or something. I mean, not that there are genes for IQ or anything, but still there could be those kinds of statistical correlations.
And IQ is inherently controversial because there are all kinds of genetic analyses that are beginning to not entirely, but roughly, directionally predict ranges of possible IQs, at very least to identify potential outliers on one side or the other. But that runs into the broader debate about IQ, whether IQ is something real, whether IQ measures something that's relevant. So these are we're talking about is human identity, and so everybody's a stakeholder in fighting that out.
But for some purposes, these questions don't matter in the following sense, like whatever IQ is or isn't, and I think it's basically just a human construct that's trying to capture. It's not some kind of essence that's in me somewhere. I have to say, I'm a believer not in necessarily in IQ, but that there is a thing called intelligence, which is relevant to whatever skills our society or our species think is relevant to our well-being, and that it's measurable, and some people have more of it than others, and that it correlates, that if you're great at math, chances are you're going to be you have a better than average chance of being great at music and being great at science. It doesn't mean it's always the case. Sure. So I think that's, I'm always, it's a little off topic, but I'm always cautious about, going to an uncomfortable area and say, oh, all right, so therefore there's no such thing as intelligence. It's not measurable. It's not even essential. Yeah. I mean, ultimately it's a question of like, to what extent is it a unified thing, and to what extent is it? In what cases does it make more sense to talk about discrete cognitive capabilities? Right. What is the correlation among discrete? Yes. And it's ultimately, but there's a sense in which none of this matters. And what I mean is this: is if right now society is set up such that there is a correlation between what you get on your SAT scores and what colleges you can get into. Mm-hmm. And it's not like SAT scores is like an essence of me. It's a particular measurement. ACT scores measure something a little different. Right. But in any event, whatever test is being used for admission to college, parents care about it. Right. There is certainly going to be some kind of statistical correlation between some genes and your likelihood of doing well on an aptitude test like that. Leave us. We don't have to debate what IQ is or SAT is. But the point is that so long as those two things are the case, some parents are going to want to use this technology. And once some parents want to use it, and it's not illegal, and some parents are using it, right away you run into these questions. I mean, just to cut to one part of the chase, like, some parents are going to choose not to use it. Some parents are not going to have the financial wherewithal to use it. It'll be expensive at first. Some parents will choose not to for moral reasons. So over time, and especially as our powers of intervention grow, you face the very real prospect of a deeply genetically stratified society, right? Where well, you can take it from there.
Yeah. So certainly there are arms race dynamics here. And there are cultural differences where people in different societies will think differently about the desirability or non-desirability of using these kinds of technologies to guide the process of procreation. And I write about this in the book. I have friends in Korea who are sending their 10 tutors a week coming to the house. Their kids are in cram schools every night after school. And when I mentioned to them, like, well, if you did have this capacity to select embryos, and let's say you get up to 10 additional IQ points based on selecting from among your 10 embryos, selecting one with the highest probability of having a higher IQ, would you do it? And for my Korean friends, it's almost everybody says, obviously, who wouldn't do that? People here in the United States are much more cautious. And they say, well, that feels unnatural. That feels wrong in some way. And there's no right or wrong answer. But certainly I live in New York City, and you see the length to which, extent to which people are doing things to give their children advantages. We know that IQ, as flawed as it is correlated with kind of most everything or lots of things that parents would want for their children, not just material success, but stable relationships, emotional well-being, all sorts of things that people would want tend to be correlated with IQ. And exactly right. Once people start doing it, I mean, there certainly will be first adopters, and people will watch them cautiously to see, well, is this something that's good? But then once people believe essentially that the error rate of procreation through science is lower than the error rate of procreation through quote unquote nature or sex, I think more and more people are going to want to take that step at first to eliminate risk. But once we've crossed that barrier, then we're going to use it for all of the reasons that are motivating our actions now. We will be the same species with the same drives, just new tools that make it differently possible to realize our aspirations.
Right. And one disclaimer I realize we have an issue, but we should probably say is you're not saying IQ is entirely a product of the genes. It's just that as long as there is some significant genetic component, as long as genetic differences, between me and my neighbor account for some degree, then these issues come into play.
Some traits are entirely genetic, like eye color. Some traits are partly genetic, like personality style, and there's a range for lots of different traits about how genetic they are and how environmental they are, and it's impossible to assess exactly. But that's what twin studies are so effective at doing, and I write about this in the book. About 50 years of twin study research over examining 18 million pairs of twins around the world. And you can kind of do a pretty decent analysis of how genetic we are. I mean, there's a question about the nature of nurture, that your parents may raise you a certain way, but why do they do it? Is it because of their genetics? So how do we assess what's what? But I believe that humans are highly genetic beings, that a lot of who and what we are is baked into us from day one. And there are beings in the world, species in the world that are much more kind of genetically determined than we are. I write about them in the book, like the Lombard's chameleons of Madagascar. The mothers lay the eggs, and then before the eggs hatch, the entire species of adults die. And so these kids are hatched, and like all you have is your instinctual knowledge. You don't have any parents. No one's telling you what to do. Everything needs to be baked in for you to survive. And so it is. Humans, one of our great advantages is that we not only have these long gestation periods, but we have long periods of childhood where we are learning very actively from our parents. As a matter of fact, our brains are far less formed at birth than even our closest relatives, other hominids. And so there's always a trade-off. And humans, we are partly genetic. And I think that the people who say, oh, forget genetics, this is all about environment and nurture, they're just wrong. But if there are people who say that everything is genetics, that's also an overstatement.
So, do you believe that, given as we just said, that having different people in a given country having different levels of access to this technology because of their income level? I mean, it will be expensive at first, and the cutting edge versions of it will always be expensive, I guess. That as a matter of policy, access to this should be guaranteed to everyone by the government if they want to choose it, if they want to use these technologies?
I guess it depends on what you mean by this. I certainly think that for the basic assisted reproduction technologies, certainly egg and sperm freezing, IVF, pre-implantation, genetic screening, at very least for high-risk parents, I think it should be. I think it's highly discriminatory and unfair that wealthier people have more reproductive options than poorer people, and that's not the case in every country in the world. It's not the case in, as I mentioned, countries like Israel that have well thought out national health plans. And so I think that we really have a lot more thinking to do here about access and about regulation. The United Kingdom, for example, is much better. These issues are much better regulated in the UK through the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority than they are here in the United States through our mishmash of different regulatory or non-regulatory authorities.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, even if you give, as I think you should, give everyone the same access to technologies, those that are deemed legal, at least, you still are going to have people who don't want to use them. Now, you seem to think you're not going to have many of those people. Ultimately, you write in the book, parents who conceive babies the old-fashioned way will seem like today's anti-vaccination zealots. Well, first of all, there are a non-trivial number of anti-vaccination zealots. Right.
I think there'll be a lot, and we have them. It's just that every one of these decisions now comes with a benefit and a risk. The people who are getting vaccinated, there's some very, very small risk of vaccination, but the benefit massively outweighs the risk. And so I think it's fine that there'll be parents who choose to not have children, to have children the old-fashioned way. I think it's fine and probably will always be fine. But other parents are going to choose to do things differently, and they'll, there may be competitive pressures that drive one response or the other over time. And certainly we can imagine scenarios where children who are optimized or selected for certain outcomes, whether it's high IQ or being great at sprinting or whatever, maybe will have a leg up. Or it could be that this entire direction is just wrong and that it's hubristic of us to think we could challenge 4 billion years of evolution and that we're smart enough to do it, and that we'll have kind of a whole generation of people who we will damage because we made these wrong decisions in the name of something that seemed good at the time. And all of that leads us to a level of at least of caution, of wisdom, of making sure that we use our most cherished ethical frameworks to guide the application of these most powerful technologies.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've been talking about parents selecting traits in a kind of competitive context. I want my kid to be smarter than the next kid. I want them to be a better athlete. And parents certainly are like that. On the other hand, parents also say at least that they want their kids to be happy. And you can...
I think happy and healthy, so certainly I think healthy will be the key driver of everything, and everything else will follow healthy. But then happy so there's different paths to happiness. One path is to say, which every parent should, I love you to their children, I love you for who you are. But there's another path.
They seldom act like that, but they do say it.
It's the nature of parenting. And but there's another path that some kids are just born happier and with sunnier dispositions than other kids. And that's genetics. So I think that for all of these questions, they can often cut in both ways.
Well, but you can also imagine, kind of challenging some fundamental aspects of human nature. I mean, one source of unhappiness is our tendency to grow dissatisfied with whatever it is we already have, right? Now, that also leads to...
That's a driver of our evolution. It's like, I'm not staying in this tree. I just think that's
well, it's a product. It's a product of our evolution. Yeah. I mean, animals that are happy after one meal and don't want any more food are not going to do well in the marketplace. Right. So, this is, I've written about Buddhism. This is fundamental to the Buddhist diagnosis of the human condition, is that we're never happy with what we have. My point is,
let me just pause you there, because I also, in the grand tradition of Jewish atheists with Buddhist leanings, am very sympathetic to Buddhists, and I'm very close with many of the leaders of the Tibetan Authority and the Tibetan exile government. But it's also true, unfortunately, that let's just use the Tibetans. They were these great, fierce warriors that everybody was afraid of. And then they accepted and internalized this wonderful philosophy of Buddhism and peace and love, and have been kind of on the defensive ever since. So all of these amazing ideals exist within this rough context of this competitive world, and that's the balance that we're all forced to find.
Okay, but I guess I'm suggesting we don't talk as much as maybe we should about the possibility of emotional engineering. Leave aside Buddhism. As it happens, the guy who popularized the idea of emotional intelligence, Dan Goleman, wrote the best-selling book. He is hardcore into, he was one of the early American Buddhists. And because part of what both the Buddhist ideal and emotional intelligence are about is equanimity. Right? Yeah. An ability to absorb, not overreact on Twitter to something somebody says and so on. But anyway, so parents could, in principle, select for, happiness in that sense, equanimity. Beyond a point, I guess you run into the problem of, people who are too happy, too equanimous, being subject to exploitation or something, that's
the point I made about the Tibetans. And so certainly, we live in a world with where there's constantly new equilibriums are being found. And yes, we could select everybody for happiness, but we may discover that it's unhappiness that's an essential driver of our advancement as a species, restlessness. And we look at some of these people like the Elon Musks, or what Bill Gates used to be, or Steve Jobs. For many of us, we've read the Walter Isaacson biography of Steve Jobs. You think, geez, this is like a really fucked up guy. 2, I'm kind of glad he was fucked up, because it pushed him to do stuff that normal people wouldn't have done, because of they have the attributes of a normal, healthy person, which Steve Jobs clearly didn't. And so that's going to be a rough balance. And it's going to be hard for us to figure out on our own, is what's the relationship between desirable personal traits and necessary societal traits. And yes, it's easy to see of everybody being happy, and then we become like a bunch of whatever koala bears just loafing around waiting for predators to get us. But it could also be the case for people who are, with the best of intentions, eliminating single gene mutation disorders, or preventing our children from being carriers of those mutations, because we don't know what every mutation is doing. It's not that it's like one gene, one function. Our genes are doing tons of different things at the same time, most of which we don't even understand. So when we start mucking around, we might fix one thing and break another thing. So right now, if a person is a recessive carrier of the sickle cell mutation, they actually have increased resistance to malaria, but they also have an increased possibility of passing on this terrible disease to their children. Mm-hmm. Do we want to eliminate that mutation to protect against the disease, or do we want to propagate it to protect against other kinds of threats? And that's probably true for many thousands of different mutations that are deleterious and dangerous in one environment, but could even possibly be helpful in another one. We just don't know about that second use.
Mm-hmm. I guess, well, two things. One point I'm making about how some parents may look more for happiness, others may look for athletic prowess or artistic ability or intelligence, is that it's misleading to think of it as a one-dimensional stratification. I think the natural tendency is to think, well, some people use this, there will be the super smart class, and then the people who are just as smart as humans are today. It may be a more diverse ecosystem than that. It doesn't necessarily make it less creepy. I mean, stratification just seems kind of unsettling to begin with. So that's one thing I'd say. But the other thing, which may take us in a different direction, is on Steve Jobs. I really, I don't think there's any reason to be particularly happy that he had the career he had. I mean, obviously the computer revolution was coming. Had he never been born, fundamentally all these technologies would be here. They might arrive more slowly. That would probably be a good thing, because so far as I can tell, the very rate of technological change is one of the things destabilizing America right now. So I'm not sure about, that's just my view. But one thing that carries us in, I want to get into the international realm, because that is a place where I really think the rate of this change, depending on how fast it unfolds, could be destabilizing. Like, it's one thing to do the policy at the national level, as challenging as that is. But it's another thing to be doing that policy in a context where people are saying, do you know what the Chinese are up to? Like, they're not putting these restraints on. They're not worried, and whether or not that's true, well, there's a problem of finding out whether it's true. There's the fact that whether or not it's true, it could still have an unfortunate effect on our policy. So why don't we start talking about the international picture, which I think is is in a way the most challenging and maybe unsettling.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, we already have reports that are as yet unverified. The U.S. Director of National Intelligence under Donald Trump had a piece in the Wall Street Journal where he talked about China doing work on genetically engineered super soldiers. And I don't think there's that much they can meaningfully do right now, but I know that they're looking at it. The U.S. is looking at it. France is looking at it. We look at He Jiankui, the highly unethical Chinese scientist responsible for the world's first 3 CRISPR babies. He was doing this in the context of Chinese nationalism. I mean, he wrote that in his various communications to Chinese authorities, and we're going to basically bring pride and glory to China. These technologies, like every technologies, will be part of competition between individuals, as we've talked about, between companies and between countries and societies, and especially because the broader suite of the tools and capabilities of the genetics and biotech revolutions, those will be I think the most important drivers of wealth and power in the 21st century. So it's inevitable that these technologies will intersect with competition between countries. And so there's a race between that happening and between those of us who care deeply about these issues and are trying to see possible futures. How do we come together to build frameworks that allow these technologies to be used beneficially for the common good? And that connects certainly to the work that I'm doing as a member of the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and to the work that I'm doing with the organization that I and others founded called OneShared.World, which is trying to look at this broader global collective action problem. Because it's the same thing with climate change and weapons of mass destruction, is that all of these these godlike capabilities that our species suddenly has, if we use that as fodder for zero-sum competition between our countries, we're just going to drive ourselves to extinction. So there's a race between all of these capabilities and technologies advancing and are developing a more meaningful framework in which to use them responsibly.
Yeah. And I'm glad to see you raise in the book the possibility of and the necessity of and some sort of international agreement. You even draw comparisons to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where the nations that had the capability got other nations to sign on to this by sharing a certain amount of the technology with them or whatever. But the first thing you need there is a consensus among the nations, that have the capability. In the current political environment, that might seem challenging. But there's also the question of, verification. If again, it's going to be very hard to make coherent national policy if we don't believe that nations we view as competitors are abiding by comparable rules. How hard is it to know what's actually going on in another nation? And is this going to call for changing the kind of transparency we demand of nations?
Yeah. So it's very difficult. And two, we must change the way that we are thinking about how we're using these incredibly powerful technologies. Right now, we're still in the middle of the COVID pandemic. And I've written a great deal about this on my jamiemetzl.com website about the possible origins of the pandemic. I've been saying since January 2020 that I think the most likely origin of COVID-19 is an accidental leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. And that means if that is the case, and hopefully time will tell, it's yet another example of China racing forward in some kind of cutting edge technology, where China, for cultural and political and other reasons, is taking steps faster than maybe they're ready for, and the rest of the world is definitely uncomfortable with. And unless this isn't about how do we contain China, but it is about how can we, as humans sharing the same planet, build a better framework for managing our competition and addressing our common challenges. And so that's certainly one of the reasons why we created OneShared.World, because we have to think big picture about, well, how are we organized? How are we humans organized? And we've had big changes over the course of our history in how we do it. In 1648, at the end of the 30 Years' War, a small number of leaders in Europe created the modern notion of the nation state through the Peace of Westphalia, and that spread around the world. And then after 2 world wars, we realized that was unstable, that we needed an overlay of international institutions, as thin as that is. And that's why we have the UN and the World Bank and other institutions. And hopefully now with the pandemic, we'll realize that in our deeply interconnected world, we need a new framework that doesn't supplant, but adds to what we've had in the past. And that's a new framework based on a deep recognition of the mutual responsibilities of our global interdependence. And it seems kind of crazy and idealistic, but otherwise, if we are in this world, as you, Bob, have described, where there's a technology in one country tries to maximize the benefits against a competing country, which now will always happen. If that's the only story, with these world-changing technologies and life-changing technologies, we're going to drive ourselves to extinction. I think there's a better path.
Okay, and one more point along those lines. I mean, the funny thing is, one reason it's so challenging is because people have certain kind of groupish tendencies, sometimes called the psychology of tribalism, but these things have a genetic basis. It seems to be part of human nature. It can warp the way we process information about another group. You can imagine changing that through genetic engineering, but again, you wouldn't want to even do that if you were worried that you would then be you might be exploited by people who weren't
and we don't have to. I mean, Yuval Noah Harari is probably the most eloquent on this thing. Like, you can get, our genetics has primed us for living in these small groups of roving nomads that our ancestors lived in for most of our history. But then it was cultural inheritance, cultural evolution that went from that to the village, to the city, to the country. So yes, we have this us and them, but if the us can go from a relatively tiny group of roving nomads to all of these totally diverse people living in the same country of hundreds of millions or more than 1 billion people, it's not such a huge cultural jump to say, and I also have something in common with everybody on Earth and the planet. So I don't think we need to.
Yeah, sure, sure, and moreover, there is a non-zero sum logic that, in principle, should draw us into connection with them. But there is the unfortunate fact that traditionally the most galvanizing kind of non-zero sum logic, say within a nation, has been opposition to another group of people, a zero sum game, and evolution seems to have engineered us to respond more readily to threats that consist of other human beings than to more abstract threats like climate change and so on. And so
that's like, I don't want to sound like Donald Trump in the debates versus Hillary Clinton, but Martians, if you're listening, make yourself known so that we can all come together and recognize that we're all just one human.
That would be great. So final question is, what your guess on time frame? Tell us where you think, what will be possible in 10 or 15 years that will make these kinds of questions really urgent?
Yeah, so in 10 years, I just think I know that our understanding of human genetics in the context of human systems biology will be much, much greater. And that is going to super empower our process of selecting from among pre-implanted embryos. And I think that I'm extremely confident that that's going to happen within 10 or 15 years, if not before. We will also continue to race forward on the issue of genome editing. And I do think that we will be making very small, and it's not going to be large numbers, even though it will be possible to do large numbers of edits, small edits initially to reduce serious risks. I also think that we're going to be doing a lot more on the editing of sperm and egg precursor cells, because that's going to allow us to have a level of iteration and experimentation that will either not be technologically possible or ethically comfortable, which would be doing the exact same thing with pre-implanted embryos. So I think those are some of the big drivers. And the essential point, though, is that our science is advancing exponentially. And when we think of rates of change, our minds, our naturally linear minds, tend to be conservative because we don't construct the world around us unless we force ourselves to do, imagining futures that are changing at a faster rate than our experience of change in the past. And that's why I always say that everybody, we need to all start thinking like science fiction writers, because our future is going to feel like science fiction. But we also need to recognize that our future today feels like science fiction compared to our ancestors. Even Jules Verne kind of imagining traveling to the moon. It was like you have a big gun and pointed it to the moon. And that was brilliant in his time. The idea that we're a spacefaring species. I mean, imagine our ancestors, wandering around the savannas of Africa. I mean, it's unimaginable. So we all need to be futurists. We all need to think like science fiction writers. And we all need to recognize that we have a role to play. The future isn't set. Everybody has a role to play, making sure that we're building a future that we're all going to be comfortable in.
Okay, quick actual final question. This just occurred to me.
Yeah.
Just to go back to this one point. Will the kind of international agreement you think is necessary call for a new degree of transparency in terms of the extent to which countries like us and China agree that, international inspectors can look here or there, can look in any college, biolab, whatever?
It must. I mean, that's what we're finding now with the COVID-19 outbreak. I mean, there were all these things that were happening. The World Health Organization had no independent means of establishing its own surveillance. China was giving it wrong information. It wasn't able to send its inspectors for nearly a month. And now we have well more than 1 million people dead, $82 trillion over 5 years of economic damage. A world which is just organized around sovereign states that can do anything that they want, including threaten the well-being of everyone on Earth. It's just not a sustainable world. So we must again, not get rid of our states, but recognize that our common needs as humans must be addressed, and we need frameworks to help us do that.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Jamie. Again, the book is Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity. And I guess people can find your stuff at jamiemetzl.com, it sounds like. Yeah,
jamiemetzl.com. There's also a Hacking Darwin site, hackingdarwin.com, where people can leave comments, debate with each other. And then the reason I've written the book is to bring people into the conversation. So there's a reader's guide with all kinds of questions people can ask each other and ask their families. There's a political guide of questions you can ask, and I hope it will ask political leaders. But this isn't, we all have to play a role in building this future. This isn't the kind of thing where we can kind of step back and let experts do it. We all need to be part of this. And that's why Hacking Darwin, I've written it kind of almost like a book you can take to the beach, written to be enjoyable, because this is a conversation for all of us.
Okay. Thanks very much.
My pleasure, Bob.